really fast that time. Yeah, so he's going to be talking about high performance and low cost nanofilm sensors and photo detectors from ANU.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. So indeed, this talk is also on more on the technical side, on some of the research we have done at ANU. And yeah, I'm Tuomas Haggren and research fellow at the ANU indeed. The outline of the talk is such that first we'll have introduction and motivation, then I will go through two device examples, one sensor and one detector, and then finally conclusions and outlook. First of all, not everyone may be aware what these 3-5 semiconductors are, so I'm using 3-5 semiconductors to fabricate these nanofilms. Their materials include examples such as gallium arsenide and indium phosphide. These are single crystalline materials, meaning that they have a very specific atomic arrangement, and the same arrangement is continuous through the whole film on wafer scale. Many of these have direct band gaps, which are useful in many applications, and some of the examples where these are used are solar cells, lasers, LEDs, and photodetectors. Then moving on to 3-5 thin films. So these are just thin devices made out of these 3-5 semiconductors, typically 2 or 3 micrometers thick. And currently some of these devices are orbiting Jupiter and exploring Mars. And this is because they can be very high performance devices. For example, the best efficiency solar cells are made of 3-5 thin films. And they are lightweight, flexible, radiation resistant, heat tolerant, durable, and they can be manufactured in scale. So they have a lot of good things going for them. Then finally, 3-5 nanofilms. Well, they are just a subclass of those thin films, so they inherit all of the good properties of those. But they are just very, very thin, just some tens of atomic layers thick, in the range of 5 to 50 nanometers. And because they are so very thin, they have different properties from bulk materials or even the thin film materials. These include pronounced surface effects, which is something that we utilize in the gas sensor, and they are also semi-transparent, and the transparency is wavelength dependent, which we then utilize in the UV photodetector. And yeah, due to these different properties or kind of novel properties, we can also enable these new device concepts. This is how we fabricate the nanofilms. So we start with a 3-5 semiconductor wafer, then we take it to ANFF ACT node to do epitaxial growth using a tool called MOCVD. First layer we deposit is sacrificial layer, and on top of that we deposit the actual nanofilm, which we will use as a device. We attach a flexible carrier on top, and then we do a chemical process which removes only the sacrificial layer and peels off the nanofilm. And then we can cut this into pieces, and to finalize the device fabrication, we just deposit contact metals through a shadow mask. So there's no lithography involved, and it's a very straightforward and streamlined process. Then we'll move on to the device demonstrations on the sensors and detectors. And the first one is a nitrogen dioxide sensor. Just briefly what it is, it's a byproduct of combustion. So it's emitted by vehicles, power stations, gas appliances, etc. And on its own, it's harmful for human health. And it also indicates the presence of fine particulate matter, which is also not good for people. Just how harmful these are, in Australia, only from traffic, the NO2 and particulate matter emissions are related to over 11,000 premature deaths per year. So for skin cancer, this same number is about 2,000. So this is definitely something we should pay attention to, and this is why it would be useful to monitor the NO2 levels. So we made a NO2 sensor from indium phosphide nanofilm, and the operational principle is such that NO2, it's a free radical and an oxidizing gas, meaning that it traps electrons. And when we have this ultra-thin indium phosphide film, in the whole thickness of the films, there's just so many electrons that can conduct current. So when it reacts with the NO2, that can have a significant effect on the resistance. So when we have these NO2 molecules interacting with the indium phosphide film, they will trap a certain amount of the electrons out of the film, and that will change the resistance between these electric contacts. And the change in the resistance will correspond to the concentration of the NO2 in the atmosphere. And here we have a short video of the NO2 sensor in action in one Australian residential kitchen. So here on the screen you can see resistance reading, and when we have the burner on, the signal starts to go up. And when we switch the burner off, a few seconds later, the signal will start going back down. So indeed, it works quite nicely in real world scenarios. And some of you may be wondering just what does this peak here correspond to? Well, it corresponds to about 150 ppb NO2 level, which is actually already above the safe limit considered for 1 hour exposure. So if you spend 1 hour in a small kitchen or a poorly ventilated kitchen, you will be exposed to harmful levels of NO2. And the situation is of course worse if you have more burners on. Some properties of the nanofilm sensor. So it's ultra sensitive. The limit of detection is in ppt level, or parts per trillion, which is quite important. As you can see here, I measured the 3 ignitions with the nanofilm sensor from the gas burner, and we can see 3 clear peaks. And then we did the same measurement with a commercial sensor, and all you can see is noise. So it's quite important for real world measurements to have this high sensitivity. We also estimated that the cost of one sensor element is less than 10 cents, and they use almost zero power, in the order of 10 nanowatts. So how much is 10 nanowatts? If you compare to a mobile phone flashlight, if you run it for 1 minute with the same power, you can run one of these sensors for almost 20 years. And as you can see in the video, it's a real-time measurement, and these devices can be flexible and therefore wearable as well. Then the next device example is a UV detector made out of gallium arsenide nanofilm. Now we all know that UV radiation is harmful. However, the intensity can be difficult to judge. For example, if you spend a sunny day in Blue Mountains and you all day long you stay in the shade, would you need sunscreen or not? Now this can be difficult to say, and I know this because someone I know did spend all day in shade, thought she wouldn't need sunscreen, and at the end of the day she was quite sunburned. So from this there arises a need for miniaturized low-cost UV photodetectors that can, for example, be integrated in wearable devices to track your exposure over time. So our device was made of 50 nanometer thick gallium arsenide film, and it's a photoconductor device, so we just measure resistance between 2 metal electrodes, and when we illuminate it with light, that generates charge carriers, and the resistance changes, which is shown here, so we can have a very clear response for UV light in the resistance. So gallium arsenide is typically used as an infrared photodetector. So how come this one is an UV photodetector? So this is because short wavelengths are absorbed much more efficiently within this very thin layer of material, which is shown schematically here. So UV light is absorbed almost completely, and it generates a significant amount of electron hole pairs, whereas visible and infrared light pass mostly through and don't generate much current. That's also seen here in the responsivity curve, which is quite low in visible and infrared, and about 10 times higher in UV region. And again, although this was a very simple device, the responsivity was up to about 100 amperes per watt, which is on par with similar MSM devices made out of thick wide bandgap semiconductors. And the flexibility is shown here. So before and after 500 bending cycles, there's pretty much no change in the behavior of the sensor or detector. So to conclude the talk, these nanofilms are promising but a largely unexplored area of research, and we can make efficient, ultra-low cost, near zero power and flexible devices, and that their unique properties also make them conducive for new device types. And in Outlook, I think there will be much more to explore and many interesting things to study. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge ARC for funding, ANFF, and particularly ACT Node for the fabrication facilities, and all of the co-workers, team leaders, and ANFF staff who helped in this study. Yeah, thank you.
Finishing on time. I'm sure that'll be taken into account. Some people may know that some of the speakers are being assessed for the inaugural Chris Fell Award, early mid-career researchers and PhDs. So finishing on time, I'm sure that'll be well regarded.
That's good to hear.
No, excellent, very interesting applications. Are there any questions from the floor?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I have a question about the gas burner experiment. So in your presentation you showed, I think, only the sensitivity but not selectivity. So did you also test it towards CO2 or other?
So yes, we did a test also for other gases, and they produce much smaller signal, some other oxidizing gases, and that's due to the electron affinity of the nitrogen oxide being quite high, whereas, for example, CO2 has quite low. So it's not enough to extract the electrons out of the indium phosphide film. So in short, yes, the selectivity is fairly good.
Yeah, I think you showed a nice graph of linearity of response. Did I see that correctly?
Yeah, I think it was quite linear. Let us.
Yeah. There.
Yes.
Have you looked at reproducibility device to device and also temperature dependence of that response?
So we did make a series of different film thicknesses, for example, and different concentrations, and every time we did get quite consistent results. So that suggests that the reproducibility is quite good. And then on the temperature dependence, so there is indeed a temperature dependence of these sensors. So if you have higher temperature, then the resistance will decrease. So it's the opposite effect of the NO2 exposure. However, in a real device or in commercial practical device, we could have one sensor which is encapsulated and one which is exposed to the gas, and then we can track all of these environmental changes or differences.
So I'll ask a supplementary on that. Have you seen any hysteresis in the response?
Let me think for a minute. I believe there hasn't been much hysteresis. I would have to double check, but I'm fairly certain that there is not much hysteresis.
I just asked Thomas, these are instantaneous measurements of NO2 or sunlight. Does the device produce a cumulative answer, or do you do that in software or post-processing? If you want to get your exposure over a period, how would you get that?
So I'm sure there will be many ways of going about that, but so yes, for practical device, of course, we would need to have all kinds of auxiliary things around the sensor element. And at this stage, we didn't really look into that much, but well, at least for the NO2 sensor, yeah, the response is indeed quite linear, so I wouldn't expect much post-processing to be required. For UV sensor, well, there the responsivity or the value we get is also dependent a bit on the intensity level, so it's more complicated. So for that one, I think there would be more post-processing needed.
So your friend can't use it to stop getting sunburnt yet?
Not quite yet.
That's coming. Look,
It's coming.
very interesting applications. Thank you very much, Thomas.
All right, thank you.